The summer heat clung to me like a second skin, heavy and unrelenting. It was the kind of heat that made the air feel thick, like you could slice through it with a knife and still not find relief. The cicadas buzzed incessantly outside, their rhythmic hum a constant reminder of the season's intensity. I stood in the kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel, the coolness of the water from the sink doing little to soothe the warmth that seemed to radiate from within me. It wasn't just the weather. It was him. Paul. My stepson. The word felt strange even in my thoughts, like it didn't quite fit the reality of who he was to me. He was only 6 years younger than me, a fact that had always lingered in the back of my mind, unspoken but ever present. My husband, Richard, was away again, another business trip, another week of silence in the house. The emptiness of the rooms seemed to echo louder in his absence, and I found myself wandering from one space to another, trying to fill the void with mundane tasks. But no matter how many dishes I washed or how many times I rearranged the living room, the loneliness always found me. And then there was Paul. He had been staying with us for the summer, a temporary arrangement while he figured out his next steps after college. At first, it had been easy to ignore the way his presence filled the house, the way his laughter seemed to bounce off the walls and chase away the silence. But as the days stretched on, something shifted. It was in the way he looked at me, those lingering glances that lasted a heartbeat too long, the way his eyes seemed to search for something in mine. It was in the way his hand would brush against mine when he passed me a cup of coffee, the touch sending a jolt through me that I couldn't explain. I told myself it was nothing. That I was imagining things. That the heat was getting to me, messing with my head. But deep down, I knew better. There was a tension between us, a quiet, simmering energy that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. It was in the way he leaned against the doorway, watching me as I moved around the kitchen, his presence a constant, unspoken question. It was in the way my heart raced when he was near, the way my breath caught in my throat when our eyes met. I tried to push it away, to bury it under layers of guilt and denial. He was my stepson, for God's sake. Richard's son. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. The lines between right and wrong blurred, and I found myself teetering on the edge of something I couldn't name. It all came to a head one evening, when the sun had dipped below the horizon but the heat still lingered, clinging to the air like a memory. I was sitting on the porch, a glass of iced tea in my hand, the condensation dripping onto my fingers. The sky was a deep shade of orange, the kind of sunset that made you stop and stare, if only for a moment. Paul joined me, his presence announced by the creak of the screen door. He sat down beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the earthy aroma of the summer night. We talked about nothing and everything. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with him. But there was something different this time, something unspoken hanging in the air between us. I could feel it, like a thread pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. And then, without warning, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my cheek. The touch was so gentle, so tender, that it took my breath away. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, the cicadas falling silent as if they too were waiting to see what would happen next. And then, before I could stop myself, before I could think about the consequences, I leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss that spoke of all the things we hadn't said, all the feelings we hadn't acknowledged. It was soft and hesitant at first, a question more than a statement. But then it deepened, the heat between us igniting like a flame. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment, I forgot everything, Richard, the guilt, the consequences. There was only him, only this. But as quickly as it had started, it ended. We pulled apart, both of us breathless, both of us stunned by what had just happened. The weight of it settled over us, heavy and suffocating. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same turmoil that was raging inside me. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. We moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken words hanging between us like a storm cloud ready to burst. I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss, about the way it had made me feel alive, desired, seen in a way I hadn't been in years. But with that came the guilt, the shame, the knowledge that what we had done was wrong. And then there was Richard. My husband. The man who had trusted me, who had brought me into his life and his family. The thought of him made my stomach churn, the guilt twisting inside me like a knife. I loved him, didn't I? I had married him, built a life with him. But the feelings I had for Paul, they were real, too. They were messy and complicated and impossible to ignore. As the summer drew to a close, I knew I had to make a choice. But how do you choose between the life you've built and the feelings you can't control? How do you reconcile the heart with the head when they're pulling you in opposite directions? The heat between us was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. And as I stood there, caught between the past and the future, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when it finally did. The days after the kiss were a labyrinth of unspoken words and stolen glances. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison of my own making. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric, seemed to echo the tension that hung between Paul and me. The heat outside was nothing compared to the fire that burned within me, a fire I couldn't extinguish, no matter how hard I tried. I avoided him as much as I could, burying myself in chores and errands that didn't need doing. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed, rearranged the pantry, and even dusted the ceiling fans, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind distracted. But no matter how much I cleaned or organized, I couldn't escape the memory of his lips on mine, the way his hands had felt against my skin. It was like a song stuck in my head, playing on a loop over and over again. Paul, for his part, seemed just as conflicted. He spent more time in his room, the door closed, the sound of his guitar drifting through the walls. The music was haunting, a melody that seemed to mirror the turmoil in my own heart. Sometimes, I would catch him watching me from across the room, his eyes dark and unreadable. But he never said a word, and neither did I. The silence between us was deafening, a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. Richard called one evening, his voice crackling through the phone line. "How's everything at home?" he asked, his tone casual, oblivious to the storm raging under his own roof. "Fine," I lied, my voice too bright, too forced. "Just the usual." "How's the trip?" Busy, he said, sighing. Meetings all day, dinners with clients at night. I'll be glad when this is over. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to scream into the phone, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness. But the words stuck in my throat, heavy and suffocating. Instead, I murmured something about missing him and promised to take care of things at home. When I hung up, I felt like the worst kind of liar. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the bedroom was stifling, the ceiling fan doing little to dispel the heat. I tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around my legs, until I finally gave up and went downstairs. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like it's holding its breath. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the sink, staring out the window at the moonlit yard. That's when I heard it, the soft strum of a guitar. It was coming from the porch. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I considered turning around and going back upstairs. But something pulled me forward, an invisible thread that I couldn't resist. I opened the screen door and stepped outside. Paul was sitting on the steps, his guitar resting on his knee. He didn't look up when I approached, but I knew he was aware of me. The moonlight bathed him in a silvery glow, casting shadows across his face. He looked older somehow, the boyish charm replaced by something deeper, more intense. I hesitated, then sat down beside him, leaving just enough space between us to pretend this was normal. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the gentle strumming of his guitar, the notes weaving together in a melody that felt both familiar and foreign. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked finally, his voice low and rough. I shook my head. "Too hot." He nodded, his fingers still moving over the strings. "Yeah. It's been a long summer." There was something in his tone, a weight that made my chest ache. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, but I didn't know how. Instead, I wrapped my arms around myself and stared out at the yard, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Cora," he said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk about what happened." My stomach twisted, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't know what to say." He set the guitar aside and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "I don't either. But we can't just pretend it didn't happen." I wanted to look away, to hide from the intensity of his gaze, but I couldn't. There was something raw and vulnerable in his expression, something that mirrored the chaos inside me. "I'm scared," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Me too," he said, his voice soft. "But that doesn't change how I feel." My heart pounded in my chest, the sound so loud I was sure he could hear it. "Paul, it's complicated. You're my stepson." "Richard." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I know what this means. But I can't keep pretending like I don't feel this way. Like I don't want you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. One wrong move, and I would fall. But part of me wanted to jump, to let go and see where the fall would take me. "This is wrong," I whispered,